The situation got worse and worse, and it really came to a head between Mother's Day and Father's Day of our baby's first year. But a couple of years before that, we loved our first house. It was in San Francisco, in the Excelsior District in the Outer Mission, near the corner of France Avenue and Moscow Street. We loved the fact that we owned it, that we were able to buy it. We loved the fact that we evaded eviction by our last landlady, who had suddenly decided to move back from Greece with her brand new Greek lover and move into our apartment. We loved the fact that we owned it. We loved the fact that our living space had increased enormously. We suddenly had 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, and a double-sized garage with a washer and dryer. We loved our backyard, even though it was all concrete. We loved the fact that we were able to break up the concrete and remove it all by ourselves. And all it cost us was 1 dumpster rental, 2 broken wheelbarrow wheels, and 3 trips to the chiropractor. We loved the fact that we could turn that concrete yard into a beautiful garden with chamomile and brick paths, tomatoes, sunflowers, zucchini, and roses. We loved our proximity to Crocker Park. We loved the fact that we could jog around the park. We loved the fact that we could watch the Samoans playing cricket there every Sunday. We loved watching other people play softball in 4 different diamonds within the park. We loved strolling among the eucalyptus lanes, watching families as they picnicked in the park. We didn't love the gunshots that emanated from the park one night, a night when one of our good friends was staying over so we could show off our cool new house. We didn't love the concrete canyon that our jogging path took us through behind one of the grandstands, which had been used as a urinal for about 100 years and still smelled like the elephant house at the zoo. We didn't love the few unsavory characters who hung out in the park. We didn't love the fact that the community clubhouse that the city had promised to build at the park didn't get completed until many years later, long after we left the neighborhood. We didn't love the weather at all. We didn't love being exposed to the Daly City fog gap, where stormy weather coming off the Pacific would come through the gap. Fog, cold, wind, all the time. We didn't love the fact that we had to wear our parkas to the park, even in the summer, San Francisco, especially in the summer. We didn't love the fact that the previous owner of our house had lied to us about the weather. When we asked him about the fog, he said, "You know, when it's foggy here, it's foggy everywhere." Not. We didn't love the fact that we had to lean into the wind when we were walking around. We were puzzled by the tepid reception that we got from our blue-collar neighborhood. We were puzzled why our new neighbors would wave to us from across the street, but never cross the street themselves to introduce themselves. This was probably exacerbated by our own natural shyness. We got a garage door opener with a remote, so we actually could drive down the street, drive into the garage under our house, and close the door behind us without ever walking on the street. Probably made it more difficult to meet people. And so the first year or 2 that we were there, we didn't really meet our neighbors at all. Until one night, in the middle of the night, 2 cars came drunkenly careening down the street, came around the corner onto France Avenue, and bam, crashed into a vintage pickup truck parked near the corner of France and Moscow. We loved the fact that the entire neighborhood then turned out into the street, that everyone was excited to introduce themselves to us, just as they were cursing the hit-and-run drivers who were long gone by then, yelling at them, talking to each other, talking to us, asking us questions, especially when was our baby due. We loved our neighborhood from that moment on. We met 2 brothers named Ambrose and Charlie who had grown up on our block. Ambrose and his family still lived in the house that they'd grown up in. Charlie had gotten married and moved away, which for them meant actually 3 doors down and across the street. So Ambrose and Charlie still lived on our block. We loved hearing about all the Italian families in the neighborhood, which they were from. They were the Botterinis. We loved learning that they had a couple dozen cousins within 2 or 3 miles of where we were standing. We loved the fact that Ambrose was one of several of the cousins named Ambrose, that they were all named after their grandmother, Ambrosia. We sort of liked the elderly couple that lived next door to us until one day they very quickly sold their house and moved away without a word to us. We really didn't like the couple they sold the house to. She seemed okay at first, but he had long, greasy hair and lots of tattoos. We loved our friends who had long hair and tattoos, but this guy seemed creepy, antisocial, something very ominous about him. We really, really didn't love that he had 3 attack-trained Dobermans. Whenever we went out in our backyard, all 3 dogs would go jumping up on the fence, barking and howling and scowling and trying to get to us. We didn't love at all that the guy really didn't care. Despite our pleading over and over with him to control his dogs, he either turned a deaf ear to what we were complaining about, or he would say things like, well, you know, the problem is you just don't like dogs. We really didn't like this situation at all. We put up with the bed rest that the obstetrician imposed for the last 4 weeks of the pregnancy. We hated the fact that the Dobermans barked day and night, despite our best efforts to get him to stop. We didn't like that he was completely oblivious when we brought our newborn baby over to meet him, and refused to change anything about the dogs in the situation. Things got worse and worse. We had really no control over it. Things came to a head between Mother's Day and Father's Day of our baby's first year. The barking was worse than ever. We called animal control, and we discovered that in San Francisco at that time, animal control was not about noise abatement at all. Animal control was about rescuing possums and raccoons that were lost in the urban forest. Had nothing to do with dealing with nuisances like this. And so, we called the police, finally. 2 officers came out, and they rang our bell, and they told us that they'd rung the bell of the neighbor next door, but he hadn't answered. They figured he was out. They could hear the dogs barking, but they explained that there was no way they could issue a citation to a house, that they could only cite people. They acknowledged that the dogs seemed like a nuisance, and one of the cops said, you know, if I had that going on next door to me all day, I'd shoot that dog. We were very surprised and very amazed when a number of our friends endorsed this path. We actually considered it ourselves, ever so briefly. Some of our friends said, well, you know, just get some rat poison and some meat, combine them, throw it over the fence, and your problem is solved. But we didn't feel that the dog should be punished for the transgressions of the owner. And we really did love dogs. The situation festered for a while. Things got worse and worse. Earplugs didn't work. White noise machines were in their infancy back then and really didn't cut the noise enough to make a difference, especially because I was in what my shrink described as a state of hypervigilance. I could, even with any screening noise, I could still hear the dogs barking in the middle of the night. A friend of ours lent us a contraption that detected dog sounds and emitted a high-pitched tone that only dogs could hear that was absolutely guaranteed to stop dogs from barking. It had absolutely no effect. We did have one small victory at the time. One time when the neighbor next door was out and the dogs were furiously barking at us and jumping up on the fence whenever we were in our yard, and jumping up on the other fence whenever somebody passed by on the sidewalk because he had a corner lot. I took out the hose and I sprayed them with the hose. They immediately went indoors through their dog door. I thought, this is interesting. The next time this happened, where the dogs were going crazy and the owner was gone, I did it again. And from that moment on, whenever the Dobermans heard our back door open, they went inside. They were pretty smart dogs. And so we regained partial use of our backyard. Now, one day, when things were pretty bad, we could hear our neighbor out back doing his bullwhip exercises. Did you know you can exercise with a bullwhip? And then apparently it's really good for your shoulder and your chest muscles. Who cares? So we knew he was home, and we could hear the dogs inside in the living room barking at something, because our houses were adjacent and had pretty thin walls. So we knew he was home, and the dogs were barking. We called the police. These cops were different. They came directly to us first, and they explained rather sweetly that the department discouraged them from getting involved in community disputes like this. We almost lost it with these cops. We showed them the log of all of our previous calls. We explained to them that the problem before, that the cops before had heard the dogs but couldn't find the owner. Now it was clear that the owner was home and the dogs were barking. We really wanted them to cite the guy. They were adamant that they weren't authorized to do that. We felt like we had the perfect storm, but they didn't want to do it. We pleaded with them, and finally I said, if you're not authorized to do this, can we talk to somebody higher up in the department who might be able to authorize this? The two cops looked at each other. One of them nodded, and the other one called the precinct. We loved the fact that a few minutes later, a police sergeant was at our front door. He came in, he talked to the guys, he talked to us, he looked at our logs. I told him that a number of his officers had advocated shooting the dog. We didn't have guns, and we didn't want to do that. We didn't want to harm the dogs. We also thought our neighbor might be a drug dealer. I mean, who needs 3 Dobermans to protect a modest home in a working class neighborhood? We thought he might be a drug dealer. We thought he might have guns besides his bullwhip. The sergeant looked at the officers, looked at us, thought for a minute, asked some good questions, and then he said, cite him. But ring the doorbell first, and don't identify yourselves until he comes to the door, in case he'd been in there playing possum all this time. A few minutes later, we heard loud voices from next door. Then we saw the cops drive away. Then we heard our neighbor angrily banging on the wall between our houses. Now what? Well, the sergeant had told us that the citation was kind of like a traffic ticket, that it would be referred to the district attorney, but the DA, in his words, had bigger fish to fry than a dog nuisance. There were actually few legal consequences if the guy decided not to pay the fine, or even if he did. The situation didn't change over the next month or two. But we were delighted when we got notification after 2 months that the DA had referred our case to a community mediation organization. We were delighted to hear that the guy next door had actually agreed to participate in the mediation. We were frustrated trying to reach our neighbors to get them to help us out. I couldn't reach Ambrose or Charlie, who we'd become friendly with. So I left each one of them a note about the mediation. I talked to the guy who lived right behind the Dobermans, who lied and said he never heard the dogs at all. They didn't bother him. There was no way. There was no way. 2 years of barking and barking and barking. He never heard them. We were delighted when Ambrose and Charlie showed up at the mediation to support us. We were delighted that the neighbor showed up as well. We were amazed that the neighbor brought a lawyer, a sweet young woman who very sympathetically said, I know our precious pets can sometimes be a little obnoxious. You know, one time I went for a run and I left my running shoes in front of outside the front door, and my neighbor's cat peed in my shoes. We were delighted to be able to look at her and say, that must have been awful. We were delighted to be able to play our tape of the dogs barking over and over and over and on and on and on. After a couple of minutes of this, the mediator said, okay, we get the point. That's plenty, thank you. We were delighted to be able to continue to play the tape of the dogs barking for another few minutes until you really shut us down. And I said, now, imagine living next door to that. We were really dismayed when our neighbor, despite being at the mediation, absolutely stonewalled us and absolutely refused to do anything or change any of his behavior or do anything different with his dogs. Until the last few scheduled minutes of the mediation, when the lawyer took him into a separate room. And after they conferred, we were amazed when they came out and she said, my client has agreed to keep the dogs in every night from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. Would that help? We were amazed to hear this. The mediator was amazed and turned to the guy and said, did you agree to this? We were flabbergasted when he sheepishly nodded yes. We shook hands very briefly and without eye contact. We signed something and then we went home. Ambrose and Charlie were really excited about this. Ambrose said, you know, I bet that guy had a record. I bet he was on probation or on parole. That's why he brought a lawyer. That's why he agreed to this. We never found out. But the guy actually did keep the dogs in every night from 10 to 6. Most of the time. But we were dismayed when we realized as our kids got a little older and closer to school age, we were dismayed by the quality of the schools in our neighborhood. And so, a year or two after that, we decided to move. We loved the realtor we found who was showing us homes in the East Bay. But we were not happy when we showed up at one place in a little town just north of Berkeley. And I got out of the car and I heard a terrible sound. The sound of a barking Doberman. I can't live here. We are not living here. I don't even want to look at this house. Take me somewhere else. We were fortunately stopped by a realtor who said, please, just come inside and look. We were amazed to discover that the barking Doberman belonged to the house that we were there to look at. We became heroes in our neighborhood when we bought the house and the Doberman moved away. We moved and loved the house. And in that house, we raised 2 wonderful kids and 4 beautiful, quiet dogs. And now, 40 years later, we still live there. Thank you.